Hello and welcome to another edition of Not Another Sports Show, a radical quick the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections of sports, politics, and radical activism. We are available for broadcast by Pacific Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live, we're also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of the podcast and video editions are also available through our site at nasradicalsports.com. To contact the show, you can use at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, the NAS hashtag, and of course, send us some contacts at nasradicalsports.com. We have a whole lot to get into this week on the air. Last week, we aired our interview with James Montague, the author of The Billionaires Club, talking about the rise of super rich owners in soccer around the world and way that fans and the public can resist, and the intersections of the politics with that. And so it is well worth a listen to go check out on nasradicalsports.com or on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Play Store. But we have a lot to get into this week, and it's a lot of the United States president this week. This week, coming off of Thanksgiving, it's a lot of the president throwing temper tantrums. That a lot of what we have to talk about this week is the president deciding to be very unpresidential and using the bully pulpit to literally do just that. So we're going to get right into it with This Week in NFL News. National treasure Marshawn Lynch, or as we consider him a national treasure, the former Seahawks running back, now he plays for the Oakland Raiders. Marshawn Lynch decided during the game in Mexico City to sit for the United States anthem and then stand for the Mexican anthem. And all season, he's chosen to sit for the anthem, but he also hasn't explained his reasoning to anybody, nor should he really have to explain his reasoning to anybody. And that's one of the beautiful parts about living in the country. You have the freedom to stand or not stand, and you don't have to go explain yourself to anybody that may wonder why you are making that choice. But Trump, of course, got all mad and took to Twitter, as Donald Trump is wont to do, and said, quote, Marshawn Lynch of the NFL's Oakland Raiders stands for the Mexican anthem and sits down to booze for our national anthem. Great disrespect. Next time NFL should suspend him for remainder of season. Attendance and ratings way down, close quote. Yes, he did stand for the Mexican anthem. He did sit during the national anthem. It wasn't really great disrespect. When you want to talk about great disrespect, we can go look at all the host of things that the administration has done that are great disrespect to the American people, and a number of human rights issues and a number of labor rights issues, number of economic issues, number of military issues. Of course, you can just go across the board and see the great disrespect, but this show idea that if one stands for a song and salutes a piece of cloth, that's like the pinnacle, the absolute upper point of the amount of respect, and then that the NFL should suspend him for the remainder of the season is not very surprising that Donald Trump would come out and say this about another black athlete deciding to be very vocal in their beliefs and very outward in their beliefs of choosing not to stand. It flies in the face of the First Amendment. It flies in the face of the basic principles of the independence of thought. It flies in the very real idea that the United States government can't police speech. And yet he's trying to do just that. Well, the wife of head coach Jack Del Rio, the coach of the Oakland Raiders, said on Twitter that she voted for Trump, but now regrets it. And it makes me wonder, I appreciate the fact that Jack Del Rio's wife is now regretting her vote and realizing that it wasn't a very good idea. But what did you think the man was going to do in the first place? What did you think was going to happen in the first place? We have a long track record of Donald Trump and allegations about racial abuse. We have long-standing track records of really horrific behavior by Donald Trump, what did you think he was going to do? What did you think was going to happen? And of course, this tweet about Marshawn Lynch and the great disrespect that was shown happened 20 minutes after Fox and Friends decided that they were going to criticize Marshawn Lynch's decision to sit for the national anthem. That Donald Trump is essentially live tweeting episodes of Fox and Friends. This is frightening, this is concerning, and this is very much something that we've seen happen where Fox and Friends airs a segment on something, and mere minutes later, Donald Trump starts tweeting about it. And in this case, they were talking about Marshawn Lynch, the national treasure as we consider him, to sit during the national anthem, and then Fox and Friends talks about it. 20 minutes later, Donald Trump is immediately tweeting about it, calling it great disrespect, and that the NFL should suspend him for the remainder of the season. Because really harsh consequences for black people has never really been a major problem for Donald Trump. Whether it's the Central Park Five, and those were a group of 5 people of color in New York who were allegedly to have sexually assaulted a white woman in Central Park. They were pretty much railroaded, found guilty, and DNA evidence proved that they were innocent. DNA evidence proved that they were all innocent, and they've been released from jail. Despite the DNA evidence showing that they were innocent, Donald Trump still said that he's mad that they got released, and during the actual trial, Donald Trump bought out full-page advertisements demanding the death penalty for the Central Park Five. 5 people who were ultimately found to have not committed the crime that they were accused of having committed. And, well, I've loved Marshawn Lynch for a number of years. From his run through somebody's face comments, which if you need the whole unedited version that I can't talk about on radio, go look it up, to the Super Bowl, I'm only here so I just don't get fined, I'm only here so I don't get fined, I'm only here so I don't get fined, being the responses at a press conference. His mother took to Twitter and asked a question. What NFL team does Trump own? Oh yeah, they wouldn't let him have one. LMAO. And that's one of the underlying things that a lot of people have mentioned as to why Donald Trump is going after the NFL. Certainly you have the racial components that he's going after wealthy black athletes to try to satisfy a base that is very much connected to racism. It's very much connected to reactionary politics. It's very much connected to a white supremacist mindset. That it's certainly connected to that aspect. But it's also connected to the idea that Donald Trump has attempted to own NFL teams for a number of years. And when he couldn't get his hands on one, he started the United States Football League. And the United States Football League, which he was running, and then Trump pretty much demolished that and destroyed it. And there's some fantastic articles. There's a whole 30 for 30 documentary called Who Killed the USFL, and it largely does all lay at the feet of Donald Trump for doing that, even as lately as just a few years ago when he tried to buy the Buffalo Bills and the Buffalo Bills ownership turned him down. That this could also be seen as some very real sour grapes of they wouldn't let him come in and play, so he's going to do everything possible to go after the NFL for that issue. But it also has the added benefit of course, playing to his base by going after a bunch of outspoken, prominent black athletes who are daring to use their platforms to speak out on a number of issues. And it plays on both of those levels. The president then started tweeting more generally about the national anthem and the idea that the NFL had where they might have all players stay in the locker rooms instead of coming out for the national anthem. Our president tweeted, quote, "The NFL is now thinking about a new idea, keeping teams in the locker room during the national anthem next season. That's almost as bad as kneeling. When will the highly paid commissioner finally get tough and smart? This issue is killing your league." Can you believe that the disrespect for our country, our flag, our anthem continues without penalty to the players? The commissioner has lost control of the hemorrhaging league. Players are the boss. Close quote. And there is so much to unpack here. The NFL is thinking about a new idea? It's not a new idea. Staying in the locker room during the national anthem was what they were expected to do up until the late 2000s when the Department of Defense and the Pentagon decided that they were going to start paying the NFL for patriotic displays like the national anthem and having a number of members of the armed forces there and having, well, we're welcoming back, Private blah, 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 or Sergeant blah, blah, blah. And it was actually a paid promotional spot to try to aid in recruitment efforts, but it was made to play up as if the teams were actually just honoring these individual soldiers. That it's not a new idea to keep them in the locker room. That's what it was until the United States government started the paid patriotism shtick, which was ultimately found out thanks to a bipartisan campaign, which highlighted the horrid use of money for all of these different issues, which didn't lead to any kind of recruitment. And it led to these lack of informed ideas of, oh, well, that team wasn't really honoring anybody. That team was getting paid to do that. That it wasn't really just a genuine honorific from the team. They were getting paid by the Department of Defense and the Pentagon for it, for patriotic displays at these sporting venues as a recruitment tool. So the implementation of the national anthem is political in the first place. It was politicized for a certain patriotic mindset, a certain patriotic idea when it was introduced. So to say it's a new idea that teams would stay in the locker rooms, it's not a new idea. It's going back to the idea that had long been in place before this new idea of forcing patriotism on them. And when will the highly paid commissioner finally get tough and smart? Well, he's certainly been tough. Don't know if we can say he's been smart. The issue is not killing the league. What's killing the league is a number of factors, like subpar play on the field, the over glut of games, the just huge amount of games that are on, expanding it to even more and more days of the week to play football games. That's killing the league. The amount of people who are cutting their cords and no longer having access to cable and choosing a number of different online venues in which to watch their favorite shows is killing part of the league. Those are the issues that are going after part of the league. And saying that our disrespect to our anthem should be penalized is problematic. And it lies right at the heart of the very First Amendment. And the argument that the players are the boss. No, they're not the boss. They're far from being the boss. The players are utilizing a right that they have. If the players were the boss, the NFL would be vastly, vastly different. If the players were the boss, you would see guaranteed contracts. If the players were the boss, you would see increased care about concussions and concussion spectrum injuries. If the players were the boss, you would see a lot better health and safety standards being put in place. If the players were the boss, they'd be making more than they are when it comes to salaries and the spread of football-related income. If the players were the boss. And when you're not really having any success with the dog whistle white supremacy workings, when do we get to call the president? And, of course, these are terms that the radical reactionary right tends to use. But when somebody takes a knee and Donald Trump starts tweeting about it, or Mike Pence has his hilariously problematic visit in October where he purposely left the game and then claimed it was because, the players took the knee and he was all sad and angry about that. At what point do we get to call them triggered snowflakes who want a safe space? At what point do we get to call the president, the vice president, and all the people who are offended that Marshawn Lynch decided to sit for a song, or all the other athletes who are raising a fist or taking a knee, when do we get to call the people who are more offended by that a bunch of little snowflakes who need a safe space, because they're more offended by that than they are the real reasons why this all is happening in the first place. They're more offended at the physical act of kneeling or sitting than they are the very real issues of white supremacy and institutional white supremacy that are very much at the core of the rationale for this protest. Colin Kaepernick was named GQ's Citizen of the Year, and it led to a whole host of reactionary backlash, including Tomi Lahren photoshopping a picture of D-Day soldiers leaving their boats coming out onto the beach with Colin Kaepernick taking a knee in the background. And it was very widely panned on social media over the fact that, sorry, Miss Lahren, actually, those soldiers would have been racially segregated during that time in World War II. They would have been racially segregated. Also, as one Twitter user whose name I can't remember right now put it, Miss Lahren, just realized that the people leaving those boats are coming for about half your fan base. And, I mean, some amazing, amazing commentary out there. The right-wing pushback was immense. It was foreseeable, and it was full of doofery about how he's this coward, and he needs to actually do something. You know, he's given $800,000 to different groups. No, but he needs to actually do something. He's helping the on-the-ground organizing that's happening. But what is he doing? That, you know, they keep moving the proverbial goalposts over and over and over again about Colin Kaepernick. And it's foreseeable, it's not surprising, and it's, of course, full of doofery. But it was really interesting to see GQ name him Citizen of the Year, when at the heart of his protest, when he started this symbolic protest during the anthem, it was over the lack of equal rights of citizenship that he had and people of color have in the United States. That was at the root of this issue. And Amir Hassan Loggins has a fantastic article about this on The Guardian UK that we'll link to. But if you think through the eras of America proper, people of color were chattel slaves. They were considered property, legally considered property. In 1857, in the Dred Scott case, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, said that the black man has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And in the brief respite that was during Reconstruction, where the Union Army was forcing the American South to actually give more meaningful rights in the South. But even in the North, it wasn't fantastic. You had limited voting rights, limited ability to be on a jury. This wasn't some magical place in the North either, where full citizenship was a thing as well. You have the rise of the Klan and violent groups like the Regulators to keep people of color from utilizing their full rights, which ultimately leads into this Jim Crow era and the civil rights movement. That Jim Crow and very overt segregation kept them from utilizing their citizenship rights. Redlining, the school-to-prison pipeline, more recently mass incarceration. You could talk about the overuse of policing in certain communities of color, especially in communities of color, where they make up a small portion of the population, but they make up a large portion of the people who have interactions with the police, that they're being over-targeted. And just because the overtness of racism has gone away from the whites-only signs, just because those signs aren't as overt anymore, it does not mean that racism still isn't pervasive. It does not mean that racism still isn't problematic. It does not mean that racism doesn't need to be systemically challenged. That we can look at the data, we can look at the instances, we can look at the evidence and show that it's an issue. But in every case, we have people going to bat for the most indefensible of behaviors. In Cleveland, when the officers fired over 100 shots into a car, killing an unarmed couple, no officer was going to be found culpable for that because they couldn't identify which officer fired the killing blow. When the officer in Cleveland killed Tamir Rice within 2 seconds of his arrival. People were more mad at Tamir Rice's mother for letting him play with a toy gun than an officer who showed up and within 2 seconds was shooting. We've got officers who were on video choking the life out of people, and when being told, I can't breathe, continuing to do that. And people are defending the officers. We've got video of a man legally carrying a weapon in his car, and goes to get his ID and tells the officer that, and the officer shoots him anyway. And we have people defending, well, what happened before the tape was on? Racism is still pervasive. Racism is still problematic. Institutional issues are still incredibly problematic. And the fact that I can sit here on the air and tell you, hey, remember when the police killed that unarmed black guy? No, not that one. The other one. No, not that one either. That other one. No, not that one. The other one. And we could sit and do this for 5 to 10 minutes, and we still would not be through all the cases. And that's just black men. Of course, don't mean to, make invisible the police killings of black women. That there's a number of instances of these cases that need to be systemically challenged. And at the time, when you go back and you look at the records of the civil rights movement, most people were opposed to the actions taken by civil rights protesters who broke the law, saying that they were doing a disservice to black people. They were the outside agitators. They were the rabble-rousers. They were not seen very positively. People like Rosa Parks, people like Dr. King. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, Time magazine had called him, what he was doing, a disservice to his people and his race, because he dared to start talking about the economic issues behind civil rights, saying that you had the simple ability to sit at a lunch counter didn't matter a whole lot if you didn't have the money to actually buy a hamburger. But we've so Santa Clausified those people, we've so sanctified them and taken any kind of radical ideology out of them that they've become part and parcel acceptable, and they're largely used even by almost white supremacists now to talk about the right way to protest and the right way to get rights. Even though we realize the fact that in the past, they were panned just like Kaepernick was panned. And as we're going to see, Kaepernick's going to be on the right side of history. We're going to have the people who are protesting these issues very much on the right side of history. In Super Bowl news, Super Bowl 52 is coming to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this week, the St. Paul Federation of Teachers, the Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en Lucha, Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, and members of Minnesotans for a Fair Economy held a press conference calling on the corporations who are seeking to bring the Super Bowl to Minnesota to instead fund more public schools. Noting that two of the big sponsors, Ecolab and U.S. Bank, both have not given their fair share in taxes. That U.S. Bank did not pay $10 million in income taxes last year, and that Ecolab has an alleged $2.1 billion in tax havens that they are keeping out of the pockets of the state. $2.1 billion. Could go a long way to fund schools and social services and public services. They also noted that the funding for schools has been on the decrease for the last 14 years, while these same companies are spending millions to bring the Super Bowl to the city. And bringing massive events like the Super Bowl or like the World Cup or like the Olympics does not actually help. It does not provide an economic boon. It does not provide a mass economic success. The data and the research is out there. It doesn't actually do any real thing that's positive for the community. And at the same time that we're seeing these decreases in spending on education, we saw the stadium debacle in 2013. After 10 years of not spending more money on education, the state of Minnesota decided to fund a brand new stadium for a billionaire owner named Ziggy Wilf, the owner of the Minnesota Vikings. They tried doing it with e-pull tab and gambling money. Yes, literally money from the poorest of Minnesota, paying for the stadium for one of the wealthiest people in Minnesota. When that e-pull tab funding didn't come through, they instead just started taking money from the general fund to try to make sure that they had enough money to pay for this stadium. And we covered this extensively in 2013. And it's well worth going back to, that we're prioritizing giving money to billionaires and to billionaire corporations and their CEOs and their top leadership, while the public suffers. And we can have all these mass celebrations like the Super Bowl coming to town, but at what point do we really have to start recognizing the impacts that it's having? And meanwhile, Jameis Winston, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback, is back in the news. And trigger warning, we are going to be talking about instances of sexual violence in this case. There are new allegations that he groped an Uber driver in 2016 that are being investigated by the league. And in all of this, I don't have a whole lot of faith in Jameis Winston that he is innocent with these allegations, especially after the 2012 sexual assault allegations while at Florida State and the subsequent debacle of an investigation that was done there by the school and the Tallahassee Police Department. I don't have much faith in the idea that he's innocent. I also don't have very much faith or trust in the NFL. And there's so many reasons not to trust or have much faith in the NFL in their investigation into this. That the NFL has no real trust for anybody to give them. And at this point, there's no real winners in this. Even when they started taking it more seriously, like with the allegations of Ezekiel Elliott, the NFL's case and their work in investigating that case weren't the greatest. It's still not the greatest. It's still not the best tool. And they have a lot of reasons why they shouldn't necessarily be trusted given their record of bad practice. And so as this continues to be investigated, of course, we'll keep up on the latest updates. But it's one of those scenarios where neither side is very trustworthy, and it becomes kind of difficult to really give more of an analysis about it. You've been listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing how Donald Trump has been whining about players using their First Amendment rights and some reactionary pushback against athletes of color who are highlighting systemic problems with the United States. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing Donald Trump finding the time to get into it with the parents of an athlete, but he didn't apparently have the time to invite the South Carolina women's national basketball champions to a shindig. They won it in April, and months later still had not been given an invite. We're going to talk about that and more in just a moment with some college sports news. In college sports news, LeVar Ball, the dad of the Los Angeles Lakers' Lonzo and of UCLA's LiAngelo, is again in the news. And before we start talking about LeVar Ball and the stay in your lane stuff with Donald Trump, let's just say the following. That his statements about women are incredibly problematic, to put it lightly. It's kind of abhorrent to see him tell female journalists to stay in their lane and not, start talking about things and kind of dismissing them just because they're female. That we've got some very real issues with that. But I also did find it that he's involved with his kids. He's, ticked off a lot of the things that we tend to tick off when it comes to trying to evaluate black parenting. That when we in the public start looking at parents of color, that we start trying to tick off, like they're involved with their kids, they're staying in their children's lives. that, you know, they're staying together as a nuclear family. Yeah, all the traditional boxes of the extra standards that we hold parents of color to have been checked off here. And we saw LeVar Ball, you know, using the media's notoriety and basically playing up being a pro wrestling heel almost to highlight a host of the issues that he wanted to focus on in building the Big Baller brand and getting a lot of notoriety and a lot of media attention for that. Well, this week, LiAngelo and 2 other freshman UCLA basketball players were arrested in China for allegedly shoplifting. And Trump tweeted, quote, "Do you think the 3 UCLA basketball players will say thank you, President Trump? They were headed for 10 years in jail," close quote. Okay, first things first. Why is our president talking in the third person? Why is the president mentioning anything in the third person? That's concerning. 2, the charges were dismissed under Chinese law because the products were returned. They didn't face a mandatory 10-year sentence, that the charges could be dismissed if they returned the products. And all 3 of the players, including LiAngelo Ball, did say thank you to President Trump during a press conference. Now, that would be the end of this story. But that wouldn't make for much of a story as we'd be talking about on the show. It'd just be kind of weird that he'd be asking if the basketball players would say thank you, and we'd leave it at that. But then LeVar Ball was asked about if he had any thanks to give to Donald Trump, and he said, no, but if I did thank anybody, it would probably be Chinese President Xi Jinping for making the decision about not charging his son and the 2 others and being able to let them go home. Well, then Donald Trump wanted LeVar to have gratitude, saying, quote, "Now that the 3 basketball players are out of China and saved from years in jail, LeVar Ball, the father of LiAngelo, is unaccepting of what I did for his son and that shoplifting is no big deal. I should have left them in jail. Shoplifting is a very big deal in China, as it should be, 5 to 10 years in jail, but not to Father LeVar. Should have gotten his son out during my next trip to China instead. China told them why they were released. Very ungrateful," close quote. Okay, let's just start with these original statements from Trump. He didn't say shoplifting is no big deal. Arguably, shoplifting is a bit of a problem, but it's not a major systemic issue. It's not some major thing that needs to be, you know, really, really incredibly dealt with. And this kid's, you know, 17, 18, 19 years old. Yeah, 18 and 19 still do some dumb things. 18 and 19 still do dumb things. That's pretty much a given. 18 and 19 still make stupid mistakes. And to say that he should have left them in jail because one of the people's parents didn't show gratitude? Holy crap. Like, you're mad that the father of an athlete didn't show sufficient gratitude to you that you're going to leave an American citizen in a foreign country in jail. Think about that kind of, anybody who supports that kind of idea. And then saying that he's, quote, very ungrateful. Well, here's the thing, President. They were never in a jail. They were in a hotel. They were never in a jail at all. They weren't left in jail. They were in their hotel when they were allowed to leave. And when LeVar Ball said that he wanted to thank the president of China, possibly, we saw, quote, "It wasn't the White House, it wasn't the State Department, it wasn't Father LeVar's so-called people on the ground in China that got his son out of a long-term prison sentence. It was me." That last part being all caps. Too bad. LeVar is just a poor man's version of Don King, but without the hair. Just think, LeVar, you could have spent the next 5 to 10 years during Thanksgiving with your son in China, but no NBA contract to support you. But remember, LeVar, shoplifting is not a little thing. It's a really big deal, especially in China. Ungrateful fool. Close quote. Well, Okay, there's a lot of stuff to talk about with this one. Trump just trying over the top to take credit for something. It may very well have been him. I doubt it and have my very real ideas that it was the State Department, it was the UCLA, and all the UCLA people that were involved in this. That there was a whole host of people that were involved in this. That it wasn't just the president, but of course we've seen the president want credit for things. And to continue to call him ungrateful is the problem here. It's this narrative of picking fights. And it's a narrative of picking fights with people of color. We saw this with the protesters in Charlottesville and the refusal to condemn the white supremacists. We saw this with Jamel Hill, the ESPN anchor who talked about Trump having a white supremacist base and using his bully pulpit to go after them. We see it with the NFL players. The large amounts of players of color being picked on for being ungrateful for the country that they live in and showing disrespect to their country. This is another narrative of going after people of color for not being supposedly grateful and showing enough gratitude. And two, Mr. Trump, you shouldn't get too much on the making fun of Don King thing, since he actively supported your campaign. And two, LeVar Ball never killed anybody. And the reactionary base, of course, has eaten this up and started attacking not only LeVar Ball, but LeVar Burton in a case of mistaken identity. Yes, LeVar Burton, the guy from Reading Rainbow, also the guy who is Geordi LaForge in Star Trek The Next Generation, has been hit with a number of tweets talking about how he's an ungrateful fool and he's raising a terrible son and it's fathers like him, that the prison population is so high, that we've seen the reactionary base go after LeVar Ball. And again, like we talked about at the top of the show with the NFL, this is just another instance of the president utilizing a base to go after people of color for not towing a line that he wants them to tow. That it's picking fights with people of color. It's continual pickings of fights with people of color. Meanwhile, spending all that time doing that did not leave him enough time to send a White House invite to the women's basketball team of South Carolina. They won the NCAA tournament in April, and in September, head coach Dawn Staley said that the school still did not receive an invite. They eventually did receive an invite, especially after head coach Dawn Staley's statements went massively public, but the team did turn down the White House, saying that they would not be able to attend, and, quote, "The only invitation we are thinking about is to the 2018 NCAA tournament," close quote. It's a very diplomatic way to say no, especially when you got slighted so badly and so problematically. But Trump did meet with a bunch of various college teams, bowling, lacrosse, volleyball, wrestling, number of others with their state championships and their NCAA championships, having those meetings happening. But South Carolina, of course, choosing not to send their women's basketball team in a very diplomatic way after not being offered much of an invite until the fact that they publicly made known they hadn't been invited. Meanwhile, the NCAA has some concussion issues to be dealing with. A former Hofstra lacrosse player sued in September to challenge the NCAA's $75 million concussion settlement fund. She noted that rules were not put in place to protect female lacrosse players, saying that the men got to wear protective headgear because body checking is legal in men's lacrosse, but since body checking is not legal in women's lacrosse, they were not allowed to wear the protective headgear. And it's only until recently that they've been allowed to wear certain kinds of protected headgear. And that's as more and more public attention is being paid to concussion spectrum injuries. The suit notes, quote, "The NCAA does not admit to breaching any legal duty to protect her, or any athlete, from brain injury, because it doesn't admit that it has any such legal duty in the first place," close quote. And that's something that really needs to be brought out here. The NCAA does not admit it has a duty to protect players from brain injuries. The NCAA talks about how they're there to protect the safety and exploitation of the athlete, that they're there to prevent them from being exploited. What they really mean is they're there to protect these players from making any kind of money. That's what they're there for. When they investigate players who are making any kind of money, they'll be right there and be incredibly ready to go after those players. They'll be incredibly ready to make sure that those players are going to see some kind of consequence, so there's going to be a massive investigation. When it comes to concussion spectrum injuries, they are woefully silent. They are woefully not mentioning a mumbling word about it, saying that it's up to the individual schools and it's not their responsibility to make sure that the school even have a policy on file, nor is it their responsibility to make sure that these schools are actually following any kind of policy. That this is so much wound up in, let's keep the kids broke, and that's basically it, but we have to dress it up more than we're just trying to keep the kids broke, because that's not going to play very well. The player also alleges that the NCAA, quote, did not effectively research, monitor, assess, or review the available data, nor did it implement or enforce any guidelines, protocols, or requirement that would have prevented my severe concussive injuries, close quote. Well, yes, because they didn't mandate any of that. They don't mandate any of that. That they've had voluntary surveys of schools asking them if they have policies on file, with no real follow-up to make sure that they actually have those policies on file and if they're actually using those policies. That we've seen this on a number of instances, and this is just one more of those instances. This is not another sports show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We have just been discussing Trump and LeVar Ball, the feud that we apparently deserve in 2017, and how it's making me come out on the end of appreciating and begrudgingly liking LeVar Ball, as well as the NCAA's concussion conundrum, which it's going to have a potential reckoning with. Coming up in other sports news, we'll be talking a lot of international soccer, some Olympics, and as we are coming off of Thanksgiving here in America, we'll get into, in our final segment, what we're thankful for in the sports world to end it on a little bit of a more positive note. But first, we're going to go to our This Week in Other Sports News. In other sports news, we have got some soccer to talk about. Football Club Cincinnati of Major League Soccer. Brightside no longer wants $100 million for stadium construction. Bad side? They want $75 million for infrastructure spending. And no one's really sure what infrastructure spending just quite means. The county and the city have instead countered, offering $50 million. And the fact that they're offering any money is problematic. The fact that they're offering anything is a difficult problem for me, because this is a situation where the current stadium they're playing in is absolutely fine. The current stadium they're in is absolutely okay to keep playing soccer. They could play in the Bengals stadium. They have outlets that they can play in. There is not a need for a massive new stadium. And Carl Lindner III is the majority owner of the team. He's the co-CEO of American Financial Group. And his family, he comes from a family of billionaires. He's got the money to pay for this stadium if he would like this stadium to happen. They've got the money. We shouldn't be financing private wealth development for billionaires on the backs of the public, especially in Cincinnati and especially in Hamilton County, who have seen some of the worst stadium deal boondoggles in recent history. Meanwhile, in international soccer news, Human Rights Watch is calling on FIFA to do something meaningful on human rights, with allegations that Russian construction workers have not been paid nor given contracts or had to work in unsafe working conditions. They also noted that a journalist who is well known for working on stories about corruption, especially cases involving World Cup corruption in Russia, was beaten by police and now faces criminal charges for his reporting. They also noted that the unsafe work conditions and the dangerous work conditions for a number of these workers have led to the deaths of at least 20 workers putting together the World Cup facilities. And so far, FIFA has done nothing. FIFA has done nothing. FIFA has done absolutely nothing. They've not said a mumbling word about it. This report from Human Rights Watch. They, of course, made grand pronouncements about how they stand for human rights, but when it comes down to actually doing anything, they haven't really done much. Meanwhile, UEFA has given a 4-year suspended ban to the Denmark women's soccer team, who went on strike in October over pay cuts and really terrible work conditions. The team received this penalty that if they don't play a scheduled game over the next 4 years, then they're going to be banned from some UEFA matches. Not quite sure why the workers are getting punished when they stand up against unsafe and unjust work conditions, but I'm not terribly surprised that Capital is going to take Capital's side. I'm not terribly surprised that Capital is going to support the side of Capital in this, and that given the decision of which side they're going to be on, UEFA is going to take the side of Capital. Meanwhile, the Court of Arbitration for Sport ruled that FIFA was wrong to fine Mexico's football administration, Mexico's FA, for fans chanting homophobic slurs at 2 specific matches in 2015 and 2016. FIFA had fined them $35,250 for those fines in those 2 games, and the Court of Arbitration for Sport said the issue was that the committee didn't punish some early cases of homophobic abuse, and so they set a standard that was wrong, but understandable that the Mexican FA would not be punished for behavior of their fans. And so these 2 fines have been thrown out, but the other fines are going to stay in place, saying that the words, quote, could still be considered discriminatory or insulting in nature and should not be tolerated in football stadiums, close quote. And now that the standard is set to actually punish with fines, that fines are going to be allowable. But we'll also have to see what FIFA and UEFA do with 3 teams, Red Star Belgrade, Partizan Belgrade, and Zenit St. Petersburg, the team famous for racist and really horrendous behavior by its fans, is again in the news, this time for fans at all 3 of their stadiums, displaying banners celebrating convicted war criminal Radko Mladic. Radko Mladic just this week was found guilty of 1 count of genocide and 10 counts including crimes against humanity and violations of the laws of war for his actions of ethnic cleansing, including the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, as well as the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. The ethnic cleansing issues of the mid to late 1990s as I was growing up, still remember those quite vividly, and to support an open war criminal, we'll have to see what the international sporting world is going to do about that. Meanwhile, in Olympics news, Rio 2016 organizers had noted that, quote, the biggest beneficiary will be the low-income worker who lives in the most distant neighborhoods and spends more time in traffic, close quote. Well, activists in Rio recently held a talk at the Institute of Applied Economics Research, and researcher Rafael Pereira found out that, no, that's not actually the case. That there was a 4.5% decrease in jobs that were accessible to residents with less than 1 hour of commute, And when it came to schools within 1 hour of commute, there was a 6.1% decrease. This comes, of course, as a number of bus companies went out of business and a number of bus lines were cut. And those cuts of the bus lines were already planned to have happened. The bus cuts that happened were already planned. And the new infrastructure wasn't necessarily benefiting the quote unquote low income worker. It was benefiting the already wealthy. And the evictions that occurred and the housing issues that this just exacerbated and, quote, reproduced a model of urban development that was segregated, fragmented, and exclusionary, close quote. Noting that most of the housing is in areas where there's scant jobs, and most of the jobs are in areas where there's scant housing. And the major transportation benefits, the major benefits that were supposed to have come with the hosting of the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Rio Olympics have not been realized. We knew very early on that the environmental legacies were not going to be honored and not going to be respected. In this case, we didn't even see that with the issues of housing and transportation either. If you're wondering when the Me Too movement was getting to sport, you just haven't been paying attention. And trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual violence here. Gymnasts of the U.S. national team, Michaela Maroney and Allie Raisman, have already come forward, alleging that they were victimized by Larry Nassar, the former U.S. gymnastics doctor. Gabby Douglas said that it is, quote, our responsibility as women to dress modestly and be classy. Dressing in a provocative sexual way entices the wrong crowd. And when she was very rightly called out for survivor blaming, she noted, quote, it would be like saying that because of the leotards we wore, it was our fault we were abused by Larry Nassar. She then publicly confirmed that she also was abused by Nassar. Internal misogyny is a hell of a thing. The Washington Post also found in their study that more than 290 coaches and officials with Olympic sports organizations have been accused of sexual misconduct since 1982, or, quote, 1 every 6 weeks for more than 36 years. And that a number of them were simply dismissed later on, and that the priority was put on winning medals, the priority is put on winning at the Olympic Games over the safety of the athletes. They only started discussing sex abuse prevention handbooks in 2011. The Boy Scouts, and there's a lot of negative things to be said about the Boy Scouts, but to their credit, they started having these discussions in 1986. 2011 is when the U.S. Olympic Committee started having them. And when they came to make the choice between worrying about legal liability or doing the best that they could to protect the athletes, they chose limiting their legal liability, noting that having an actual handbook could get them sued and be used as evidence that they weren't doing enough. Because refusing to acknowledge the issue and think that will fix it is responsible, apparently. And when you're choosing minimizing the legal liability, you made the wrong, unacceptable choice. Now, we've only got a few minutes left in this broadcast, and we really didn't want to end on a negative note because it's been a lot of really negative stories. It's been a lot of really problematic stories as we're plumbing new depths of a political nadir, of a reactionary political nadir. And with this week being Thanksgiving here in America, we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what we're thankful for when it comes to the sport world and the surrounding world. And first off, thankful for the growing resistance building in a world of reactionary politics and really horrid views, where even things that you didn't think were controversial, like Wolfenstein 2, the new video game coming out, killing Nazis, with people getting mad at Machine Games and Bethesda over the fact that Nazis are being killed in the game, that somehow this is a political statement about the alt-right and the current environment that we're living in. But in a political space that we've been plumbing to new depths, every time we think we've hit a nadir, we're finding new ways to sink. There's been this continued resistance. There's been a continued effort and a continued pushback. And it's really heartening to see. And it's heartening to see the athletes. It's heartening to see the people coming together and really recognizing that it's more than the quote-unquote hashtag resistance to just Donald Trump, that largely the government does not necessarily have the best interests of people at heart, and on a number of issues, right or left, coming together and being able to find affinity on certain issues and coming together in continued resistance to systemic oppression. It's really heartening to see. It's also really heartening to see efforts like Burn It All Down, the feminist sports podcast, and the absolutely phenomenal work of their past show guests, like independent writer Shireen Ahmed or independent journalist and writer Jessica Luther, as well as Think Progress's Lindsay Gibbs and Brenda Elsey. And I really appreciate the work that they've been doing, highlighting the voices of women and highlighting the women, especially women of color, on their broadcast, talking about these issues of sports, feminism, and politics really interacting and really intersecting in very important and very serious ways. As well as I really appreciate the fact that Shireen Ahmed has curated a fantastic list of women of color sports writers, and it's an absolute treasure trove of quality writers and potential interviews, potential guests for upcoming episodes to help signal boost and amplify the work that they're doing and represent the work that they're doing by having them speak about it. And I'm also really thankful to have brought probably the most listened to broadcast of this year being our talk that we had with Hangoren no Kai, the Japanese anti-Olympic group, literally translated anti-Olympic group, talking with us about the varying interests that they had to oppose the Olympics as they're coming to Tokyo in 2020. And being able to have that discussion with our translator that we had access to in New York and talking with them in Tokyo, and being able to highlight the very serious issues that were taking place in Tokyo, but seeing how they intersected with the issues that we've brought up and we've looked at when it comes to issues in England when they hosted, or Vancouver when they hosted, or Pyeongchang when they're set to host, or Russia when they hosted, that we're seeing these issues difference ever so slightly, but some of the main themes all staying the same, and being able to amplify the grassroots voices of the people doing the work to resist oppression, to resist, and not just in the quote-unquote hashtag resistance that thinks the Democratic Party is going to be the magical fix of everything for us, but a real resistance, a real grassroots movement to put the power back into the people's hands. This has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacifica Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's show, we're also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are available through our site at nasradicalsports.com. To contact the show, you can use at Nas Radio Sports on Twitter or Instagram, at Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, at nasradicalsports.com, or the Nas Radio hashtag on social media. For all of us here at the broadcast, this has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, and we will be back with you next week to talk about the world of sports, politics, and radical activism.